My father was a diplomat who shook hands with the most powerful people in the world. A businessman with foreign affairs, managing an empire so vast that the sun never set upon it. He was an army veteran in Afghanistan and a doctor in Ethiopia. In fact, he was so important that he went everywhere and did everything, except for coming home, that is. When I was little, I used to love hearing stories about him. I liked to imagine that I'd get to meet him someday, and the two of us would go everywhere I heard about in my mother's stories. It wasn't until I was 8 years old when I realized how strained her voice was when she talked about him, or how selfish I was for bringing him up. I didn't ask for any more stories after that, and Mom never brought him up on her own. She must have loved him terribly for it to still hurt all these years later. My mother once said, the longer you wait for something you want, the better it is to have, like interest building up in the bank. So every day he didn't come home wasn't a punishment. It would only make the reunion that much happier when it finally did happen. It would have been so much easier if he did come back though. I wouldn't have to walk home from school because Mom would be there to pick me up. And I wouldn't have to make my own dinner because Mom wouldn't need a second job in the evening. Some nights I tried to stay up until she got back, but I'd usually fall asleep on the couch watching TV and wouldn't see her until the morning when she woke me up in my bed. The older I got, the more my mother's stories didn't make sense. Even if only one of them were true, he must have had one opportunity to visit by now. Army contracts are only 4 years, and if he was as rich and important as she said, then he must have been able to send a little money so my mom wouldn't have to work so hard. The only explanations I could think of were that he was either dead or lost. If he was dead, I intended to find out where he was buried, so Mom wouldn't have to keep waiting. If he was lost, I'd help him find his way home again. A friend suggested that my parents might have gotten a divorce and didn't love each other anymore, but I didn't think that was true. Mom wouldn't still be hurt if she didn't love him, and I didn't think it was possible for anyone not to love my mom. So I started my search. I asked my grandparents on my mother's side, but they were tight-lipped and quick to change the subject. I spent my lunches looking for him online on the school computers, but there were hundreds of people with the same name, and I only had a single grainy photo to compare it with. He might have gained weight or grown a mustache, or even lost an arm in battle for all I know. The one thing I was sure about was he never changed his name, because if he was lost, he'd want to be found again. So I started going down the list of hundreds of people with the right name, and sending them each a message asking them if they were my dad. Most didn't reply. Some seemed concerned, others creepy, but I didn't let that bother me. I started out with my city, Serenity Falls, but quickly expanded my search to the whole state of Wisconsin. We'd moved around quite a bit when I was younger, but we'd never left the state, so I thought that's where he might have been looking for us. Then, one day, I messaged someone and asked if they were my father. He replied with my mother's name, and I knew I'd found him. He was older than I expected, and most of his hair was gone, but he still looked a lot like the photograph, a lot like me, and no one using the other school computers could understand why I started to cry. He asked a lot of questions about my mother. He asked for pictures of her, and wanted me to tell him everything. I told him what city I lived in, and he promised to drive there right away, even though it was over 100 miles away. He didn't seem to mind that Mom would still be at work, because he was excited to meet me too. For the first time in my life, my dad was going to pick me up from school. I couldn't focus or sit still through all of my remaining classes. When the final bell rang, I exploded out of my chair so fast that I knocked my whole desk over. But I didn't stay to pick it up. I was the first one out of the building and was waiting on the sidewalk within a minute. He was already waiting for me. My dad had even less hair than his picture, but I didn't mind because he drove a red Ferrari. I asked if he really was an international businessman, and he laughed and said he did that in his spare time. He didn't want to meet Mom at home or at work because that wasn't romantic. Instead, he wanted to take me to the real Serenity Falls the town is named after. That's where they had their first date, and she could meet us there. I texted Mom and let her know that there was a surprise waiting for her there, and she promised to get off of work early. It was only about a 25-minute drive, but I feel like we really bonded in that time. Dad didn't like talking about himself and asked me 1,000 questions instead. What games did I like to play? How did I do in my classes? Who were my friends? And 1,000 of other things. His eyes would light up even with the most boring answer, as though it was a miraculous revelation from on high. I teased him for that, but he got all serious and said, "You don't understand. I didn't even know you existed until today. You aren't just telling me about yourself. You're being created from nothing, right here in front of my eyes. It really is a bit like a miracle." Serenity Falls was quiet around the Christmas season. We were the only ones in the parking lot, so we got to drive all the way to the head of the trail, which led to the viewpoint. The water was all frozen in snow and ice, and it wouldn't be a waterfall again until the thaw of the spring. It was still beautiful because of the long icicles lancing off the jagged rocks. The light seemed trapped within the crystals, which shimmered as the light faded. We stood together in silence, overlooking the falls for several minutes. I started to shiver, but he put his arm around me and drew me close, and I almost started to cry again without knowing why. "When is your mom going to be here?" he asked at last. "Not for at least an hour." "Do you want to wait in the car where it's warm?" he asked. "Why did you really leave?" I blurted out. He withdrew his arm from around my shoulders, and we stood together in silence again. "I lied earlier," he said, still staring at the hanging ice. I counted 26 individual icicles before he continued. "I did know you existed before today." "Then why did you—" I cut myself short. "I wasn't ready. I loved your mother, but I didn't want to have a family yet. I'm sorry." I shrugged as if it had nothing to do with me, but I couldn't look at him. "Were you really in the army?" "I was." "And a diplomat and a doctor?" He laughed in response. It was a warm sound, and I wasn't shivering anymore. "But you really did love my mom?" I asked. "I still do. More than anything," he said. "That's why I'm here. But I'm still not ready to have a kid. I don't think I'll ever be." It hadn't gotten any colder, but I started shivering again anyways. He put his arm around me again, but it didn't feel as comforting as it had before. His fingers were gripping my shoulder a little too tight. "It's only going to be cold for a minute," he said. "After that, you won't even feel it. It'll just be like drifting off to sleep." "I want to go back to the car." I tried to pull away, but he wouldn't let go. "Everybody wants something," he said, "but not everybody is willing to do what it takes to get it." He slid behind me, and suddenly both his arms were around me. I struggled and kicked, landing a solid one into his thigh before he got me off the ground. He grunted but didn't let go as he lifted me over the railing. I braced my feet against it and tried to push back, but he lifted me even higher until I couldn't reach it anymore. He flung me over the ledge to tumble down the 20-foot drop to the frozen water. I smashed right through the ice and plunged into the numbing depths. I spun over once or twice trying to orient myself, and by the time I was able to search upward again, I couldn't find the hole I'd broken through. All I could feel was the underside of the ice. It was thicker than it seemed when I fell through. My numb fist moved sluggishly through the water, pounding feebly. I went back to searching for the hole instead, but the freezing water stung my eyes so badly I could barely see. I saw the vague outline of his shape through the ice though. He was standing directly above me looking down. He watched me flail against the underside. The weight of my wet clothes was beginning to drag me down, and my chest felt like it was about to explode. Each time I surged upward, it became a little harder to reach the ice, until the time I couldn't reach it at all and began drifting down. I watched him turn and begin climbing up the slope, and everything went black. I came to a moment later when I heard the sports car rev to life and pull away. I lurched up again, and by blind chance, one hand slipped through the hole in the ice. I couldn't feel my fingers as they latched onto the edge. Somehow, the air was even colder than the water, but inch by excruciating inch, I dragged myself upwards, and I pulled myself from the water. I was barely alive when my mom found me. I didn't want to tell her what happened, but even lies meant to protect someone can do more harm than good. I told her everything, and she promised never to let that man back into her life again. If my future children ever ask about my father, I'm going to tell them the truth, that he tried to kill me, that he was never caught, and that no family is incomplete that has love.